had COVID not that long ago, and he's like 84, I think, and he was fine. Like they took him to the hospital, and he was sick while he was there, like really sick. But then he recovered good, so I was surprised. Like we all thought, we're like, okay, well, just like this is the end, but it was okay.
It's just amazing how it affects different people.
Yeah.
It's like Dr. Al. He was. Hey, how's it going? He's, oh, I'm not doing good. I don't feel good. So what's the matter? So I took the vaccine. And the vaccine's making him sick. So I don't know. It's a crapshoot. Everything. I'm starting late today. Okay. I'm gonna share my screen. We're getting a little late start this morning. I'm sorry. We were in here visiting, talking about important stuff. Oops. Get this out the way. Here we go. Let's see. What were we talking about last time? Y'all remember? Yeah. The meninges, I think, right? Wait, what's today? Thursday? Right, okay. I think that's it. Is this it? That kind of looks like it. Yep, there it is. All right. Fix my display here. There we go. So finally we can get started. Let's see, last time, what were we? Oh, we were just talking about parts of the brain, man, just the regions of the brain. And we finished all that up. And then this next slide is talking about the protection of the brain and spinal cord. And we've kind of talked about the protection in the brain and the spinal cord in passing when we were talking about the skeletal system, the skull, and function of bone and that sort of thing. And then also introduced you to cerebral spinal fluid. Remember we talked about that, CSF? Well, there's three things that protect the brain and spinal cord. Of course, bone, cerebral spinal fluid, and then these structures right here, which are collectively called meninges. And that's the main thing I wanted to talk about, or the meninges of the brain and spinal cord. The word meninges literally means membranes, which is plural. The singular for meninges would be meninx. There's three connective tissue membranes separating the brain and spinal cord from the skull and the vertebrae. And you see these different colored structures right there. I don't know what color that is. It's like light purple, blue, and dark purple. Is that purple or pink or pinkish? What color is mauve? Mauve. Okay, we're gonna say it's mauve. She says it's mauve. I guess that's a color. Okay, what are they? Well, there's three of them. The superficial most one, the mauve colored one, it's called the dura mater. Dura, like durable, means tough. Mater means mother, so it's one tough mother. How about that? The dura mater is the superficial, very fibrous meninx. It is double layered, and look carefully, it's actually split. It's double layered in the skull, and it's only double layered in the skull. And if you remove the skull from a subject, or remember how we talked about making a Calvarian cut where you take off the skull cap? If you remove the skull cap, you don't just see brain. What you will see is this, it won't be purple or mauve. it's white. It's very, you know what it reminds me of is, you ever heard of Tyvek? Or is it Tyvek or Tyvex? I don't know, it's that white paper kind of stuff that they wrap a house in before they put it on the siding, and the brick or whatever. Have you ever felt that stuff? It's very, very, very tough. It's not like paper you can tear, but it's very fibrous, tough covering. And it's a lot like the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater is this white, very thick, fibrous material that encloses the brain. So you'd have to cut through that then to see the brain. But like I said, it's double layered in the skull. And these are the two layers. The periosteal layer, that's the layer that's just up underneath the skull. This is the layer that's absent in the vertebrae. So you only have the periosteal layer in the skull. But the meningeal layer, that's the deeper one. The meningeal layer surrounds the brain and spinal cord and forms the dura septa. Sometimes the dura septa, this thing jutting down between the two hemispheres right here. Sometimes it's called the falx cerebri. Falx, I think that's how you pronounce it, falx. Means sickle, like an icicle, like hanging down. I guess it kind of looks like a little icicle kind of hanging down. It comes down, if you follow it down, it stops at the anterior cranial floor by anchoring to the crista galli. Remember the crista galli? That's that process on the ethmoid bone. Remember that? Well, anyway, that's what it's attaching to. And so I guess functionally what it's doing is, it's coming down, it's anchoring, and it's between the two cerebral hemispheres. And the idea is that it helps kind of compartmentalize each cerebral hemisphere that's basically floating in cerebral spinal fluid, and it keeps them from splashing together. So it reduces brain movement, or at least movement of the hemispheres between each other. But anyway, there's that. The second meninx is called the arachnoid mater. Well, remember, Dura Mater means tough mother. Arachnoid mater. What's arachnoid mean? Have you heard of arachnophobia? If you have arachnophobia, what are you afraid of? Spiders, yeah. So arachnoid mater means spider mother. It almost sounds like some kind of villain or something, Spider Mama, or maybe it's a superhero. Da-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Spider Mama. I don't know. Why do they call it the spider mother? Well, this blue layer right here. Oh, because it looks like it has spider webs on it. Anyway, here I define it as the middle meninx, separated from the dura mater with serous fluid in this little space, this little bracket, that little space right there is the subdural space. And in that space, there's a couple of things worth noting. Well, first of all, there's just serous fluids. You got these two membranes that are kind of sliding across each other. They're very slippery. So we distinguish that layer or that space from the layer underneath it, or the space underneath it, which is the subarachnoid space. See right here, subarachnoid. In the subarachnoid space on the other side, the deep surface, that's where you find the cerebral spinal fluid, the CSF. So on this side, you got CSF. On this side, you have serous fluid. And so it's in the subarachnoid space, you would find the cerebral spinal fluid. And if you ever had like a spinal tap, or if they withdraw spinal fluid, from your lower back, it's the same space, but that's what the space they're accessing is the subarachnoid space, because that's where your CSF would be. They don't, access it from your skull, but it's the same stuff, same place. Okay, what else? Well, this is where it gets its name from, arachnoid, because it has these little fibers that kind of look like little spider webs, the arachnoid fibers. If you look carefully in the subarachnoid space, these little fiber-looking structures, I don't know if you can kind of see that. The arachnoid mater itself is fibrous. and you got these collagen fibers. And then some of them kind of descend down through the subarachnoid space and anchor to the surface of the brain. Of course, you can see the surface of the brain. That's that third meninx that we're going to call the pia mater. They anchor to the pia mater. Okay. Also noteworthy, associated with arachnoid mater, are the arachnoid villi. If you look carefully, there's a little plume-looking structure right there. And then there's another one right there, and another one right there, and they're everywhere. What these little plumes are, they're like little capillaries that extend up from the arachnoid mater, and they tap into this blood vessel right here, right there in the between the periosteal layer or meningeal layer of the dura mater. There's a large vein called the superior sagittal sinus. And that's, part of the circulatory system. And so remember where the CSF came from. Cerebrospinal fluid comes from the choroid plexus, the choroid plexuses that is part of the circulatory system. Remember, it comes from the blood and ends up as CSF in the ventricles of the brain, right? And so here is where the cerebrospinal fluid is actually returned back into circulation. So it's constantly being like filtered and recycled. So the cerebrospinal fluid comes from the choroid plexus, and then it's in the subarachnoid space, and then it returns back into the blood at this point in the superior sagittal sinus by way of these arachnoid villi. You see that? Does that make sense? And so that way you have a optimal level or pressure or volume of cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space at any given time, okay? If you have too much or too little, it's regulated. Now, if you have too much, that's a problem. We've heard of like too much fluid on the brain. Well, the pressure in here is built up too much. And of course, if you put too much cerebrospinal fluid in there, it's going to, kind of crush the brain. And of course, it's going to create problems. Or you've heard of other pathologies like meningitis, like inflammation of the meninges is what we're talking about, these things. Or encephalitis. Now, that's usually what that is. Encephalitis is with too much cerebrospinal fluid causing central nervous issues. Okay. But anyway, that's all your arachnoid mater. And then finally, the pia mater. P-I-A means gentle, like a little delicate, because it's very, 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 very thin right here on the surface of the brain. So I define it as the deepest meninx on the surface of the brain. It's very thin and delicate. It separates the brain tissue from the cerebrospinal fluid and provides an attachment site for the arachnoid fibers and also blood vessels, because you're going to have surface blood vessels on the surface of the brain. You can actually see one right there. Well, they're just not sliding around. Remember, there's remember, everything has this kind of like fibrous outer covering. Remember how I told you that everything always occurs in threes? Did I tell you that? Three. Well, here's your three meninges. You get three tissue layers of whatever. Well, the superficial tissue layer of blood vessels is usually a fibrous structure. All right. The tunica adventitia, as it's sometimes called, or the tunica externa. But it's made out of the same material. And then you got collagen fibers, and then they intermesh and they anchor to this, whatever. Well, remember the cerebrum has all these gyri and sulci. Remember the grooves and the folds, and so like here's a sulcus right here and a gyrus right there. As these shapes. Well, the pia mater kind of helps maintain the shape of the brain, because the brain tissue itself is very, it basically has the consistency of cottage cheese. It's very soft. It's not very fibrous or anything. but to kind of give it shape and hold it together, I mean, that's what the pia mater does, okay? Anyway, there's your brain. And that's the brain and the meninges. Now we can move on to the spinal cord. Remember the spinal cord, it's just kind of an inferior extension of the brain, because remember both the brain and the spinal cord developed from that dorsal hollow nerve cord, right? And so I define the brain right here as, or I define the spinal cord here as the continuation of the medulla oblongata within the spinal cavity. It begins at the foramen magnum. Remember, just because it's, you know, everything outside of the skull essentially is spinal cord. If you're inside the skull, your brain, okay? And so that's it. So remember, the foramen magnum is the opening into the cranial cavity. All right, so from the foramen magnum, like right about here, all the way down, 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 down to where, see, it kind of tapers. It doesn't go the entire length of the dorsal body cavity, of the spinal cavity. You see how it stops short right there? Where it comes to an end right there, it's called the conus terminalis. Sometimes it's called the conus medullaris, or the medullary cone, because it means like, it comes to a cone-shaped structure in the middle there, or conus terminalis just means the terminal cone, or the cone at the end, because it kind of tapers. You see that? It stops right about here, which is about the level of the first or the second lumbar vertebra, okay? So why doesn't it go the entire length? Well, it used to, like when you were born, but your spinal cord stops growing before your vertebral column. And so the vertebral column continues to elongate, and as it elongates, well, the spinal cord just kind of gets left behind. And so the corresponding spinal nerves that are coming out, they're doing fine, except these guys down here, they have to kind of extend down inside the spinal cavity for a short way before they emerge. And we actually have a name for that right here. The spinal cord gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Each exits the spinal cavity via intervertebral or sacral foramina, or remember the sacral hiatus. There's always an opening for the spinal nerves to emerge. All right. Beyond the conus terminalis, the spinal nerves of the lumbar, right here, the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerves travel within the spinal cavity, see in here, as the cauda equina. So that's what you call these spinal nerves that are inside the vertebral canal right here. See them in there? Cauda equina, which means horse's tail, because I guess it kind of looks like a horse's tail. And so it's the cauda equina before they emerge where they're supposed to, associated with a related vertebrae. Okay. The spinal cavity terminates by an extension of the pia mater, which anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. This little extension is called the filum terminale, or the terminal thread. You can hardly see it, but it's kind of see where everything kind of tapers together. So right here, the meninges are kind of cut open so you can see inside. You kind of see the little membranes on the side, and they kind of come together right here in the sacral vertebrae, and then of course come to an end before you form the caudal vertebrae, and it just fuses and is anchored to the tailbone. That's where it all comes to an end. All right, so let's look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. This is a cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. Of course, here's the spinal cord itself, and notice it's hollow. Not a big hollow space, but it's technically hollow. So that hollow space in there is continuous with the hollow space that's inside your brain, the four ventricles of the brain, etc. And then, of course, you can see where the spinal nerves are attaching and all that. Of course, this is dorsal back here, and this is ventral right here, okay? So what do we have in there? Well, here I tell you that the spinal cord consists of an area, a central area of gray matter, which is divided into two dorsal horns and two ventral horns. See this gray, I guess that's gray, it's kind of darker color. So these two things sticking out right here, they're called the dorsal horns because it's on the dorsal surface. And then these, you know, right here, oh, it kind of looks like some kind of creature or something. Anyway, these things in the front or anterior or ventral, they're the ventral horns, okay? Anterior horns, ventral horns. But it's gray matter. The right and left halves are connected by a gray commissure, or in the center is the central canal. So the commissure or commissure. Tomato. Anyway, they're connected here in the middle, and then there's a hollow part. That's the central canal where you'd have cerebrospinal fluid in there, and of course you'd have cerebrospinal fluid out around here, enclosed by the meninges. Of course, the meninges aren't shown in this illustration. So what do you have these horns? Well, if you haven't noticed, you can see that the spinal cords are connected to these horns. That's what the association is here. So these horns are connected to two different parts of the spinal nerves, and it's different. Here I tell you that you have sensory fibers. Remember I talked about sensory versus motor. Remember all that? We have sensory motors enter the dorsal horn right here. These are where the sensory fibers connect. Sometimes with you have an inner neuron, and then they exit by way of a motor neuron. So you get your sensory fibers here, motor fibers here, sensory fibers, motor. So if you're drawing like an arrow corresponding with the direction of impulse, you know, impulses are be coming in this way. That's all sensory, right? And the impulses will be coming out this way. That's everything. So this is all motor. It's all sensory. Okay. And so that's how that's laid out. So this is all gray matter. Okay. And then everything else, this lighter colored, is white matter. So the white matter consists of bundles of myelinated axons that run up and down the cord to and from the brain. The white matter is arranged into columns. You have dorsal columns. I mean, it doesn't look like a pretty nice round column, but this little wedge right here is called one of the two dorsal columns, here and here. And then this is all lateral columns, and then ventral columns. And if you think about this, the spinal cord, it's kind of just the opposite as far as the gray matter versus the white matter compared to the brain. Because remember, the brain on the surface was all gray matter. Here, the surface of the spinal cord is all white matter. The gray matter is deeper. Okay, so this is deeper gray matter, and then this more superficial white matter. So this is just myelinated and then unmyelinated axons. That's that. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about the spinal cord. All right. And if you study the nerves, the spinal cord is a little bit more interesting because that's what the nerves are, at least the spinal nerves are connected to. And so here we start the peripheral nervous system. And actually, rather than start, I don't know why I did this, rather than start with the cranial nerves, I started with the spinal nerves. I don't know. Maybe your book did it like that. I can't remember. But anyway, the peripheral nervous system, remember, is all the nervous system structures outside the brain and spinal cord. And so here we're looking at a nerve, just any old nerve, be kind of categorized like this. So you have a general features and structures of a nerve as an organ, all right? Nerves are bundles of nerve fibers. Now there's that word again, fiber. Remember we had muscle fibers, this kind of fiber, that kind of fiber. It just depends on what the context in which you're using the word fiber. Nerve fiber is just the axons of the neurons. Remember, the functional nerve cells are called neurons. In parts of the neurons, you had axons and dendrites and cell bodies. Remember all that? And then you had muscle fibers with the entire cell, all right? And then you had collagen fibers, which is just protein, all right, basically. Well, when you're talking about nerve fibers, it's just a portion of the cell. just the portion of the cell that's actually transmitting a nervous impulse, okay? So when you're looking at a nerve, that's what you're looking at. You just look at bundles of axons, okay? There you go. There's your number 3. Everything's 3. 3, 3, 3, 3. There's 3 connective tissue tunics that organize and compartmentalize the nerve fibers to form the nerve. And it's going to sound very reminiscent to what we saw in the muscles, remember? The endomysium. Now you have endoneurium. Same kind of deal. Endoneurium wraps each fiber, and then the fibers are grouped into fascicles. And so the fascicles are grouped. Is that a word? Wrapped or grouped. There's no hybrid word. Grouped. Anyway. Perineurium, the second one. That's the one that wraps bundles of fascicles. And then the entire groups of fascicles, the entire outside, that superficialmost layer, is the epineurium. Here I tell you, the epineurium encloses all the fascicles forming the outer tunic of the nerve. The areas enclosed between the fascicles, which is known as the interfascicular space, all right, contains adipose and areolar connective tissue and blood vessels and lymph vessels. So you can kind of look carefully, you kind of see that the white space in there, that's the interfascicular space. And there's stuff in there. Loose connective tissue like areolar adipose. And then you can find some blood vessels in the larger nerves, maybe even some lymph vessels. Okay. Let's see. Let me do something here. I do this just about, gosh, dog it, every now and again. I did it the other day, and I'm going to do it again. I edit on the fly. Have I done this in this class yet? I'm going to, see that word, interfascicular? I like that word. But it doesn't like, my computer doesn't like it. I'm going to, can I underline it? No, it's italicized. I want to underline it. There. There. I want you to know what I'm talking about. We're talking about the interfascicular space. Now that could be, that's not something reserved just for nerves. I mean, that just means this, a space between the fascicles. But it is important in the sense that when you're talking about nerves, you're gonna find stuff in there like blood vessels and connective tissue. All right, did I save this? Save. Yeah, I made this PowerPoint. This is an old PowerPoint, and I made it back when PowerPoint was new. That's how old this damn thing is. And back then, you know, you didn't have ready-made PowerPoints. You just make them yourself. And so I made this, and I've been editing it ever since. Every semester, I kind of fix it. So, hey, this semester, you have the latest and greatest version of my PowerPoint. It's better than last semester, right? At least I think it is. I think I'm improving it a little bit every semester. So, there's that. Doesn't that look nice? Now, remember we had functional types of nerve fibers. Well, since nerves are collections of neurons, and neurons are parts of nerve fibers, you're going to have functional types of nerves. And so I tell you that, yeah, there are 3 types of nerves based on how they transmit impulses between the CNS and PNS, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, with sensory and or motor fibers, okay? And so the nerves will contain, it depends on the fascicles. The fascicles are going to be wrapped up, they're always going to be wrapped up with axons, but it just depends on which way the axons are pointing, okay? And so here you have nerves that are called sensory nerves or they're afferent nerves because they contain afferent fibers or sensory fibers. Same thing. Here I put CNS, PNS. It's the direction of the impulse. The impulses are traveling towards the brain and spinal cord. That makes sense. You would have just sensory fibers. So that particular nerve that has only sensory fibers in it would be a sensory nerve. That makes sense, right? Likewise, you can have just the opposite. On a completely different nerve, you can have it just packed full of fascicles containing motor fibers and directed out towards the peripheral nervous system. So from the brain and spinal cord towards the peripheral nervous system, towards the effectors. So those would be just pure motor nerves. You call them motor nerves, or you can call them efferent nerves because they contain efferent fibers. Now, the third thing, you can have nerves that are called mixed nerves. Mixed nerves, look at my central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. It's going both ways. It contains both sensory and motor fibers. Now, you'd have different fascicles. You have some fascicles that are afferent, some fascicles that are efferent. You can never have a fascicle sending impulses two different directions, okay? So it contains both fibers wrapped up independently, but all enveloped inside the same nerve, okay? So you can have in your body three different types of nerves, just pure sensory, pure motor, or mixed, okay? So there you go. Now, for the types of nerves, we're gonna start with spinal nerves, all right? Spinal nerves connect the central nervous system. It's functionally what they do, to sensory receptors, muscles, and glands. Because they are to the periphery of the spinal cord, they are all in the peripheral nervous system. That makes sense, right? They're all peripheral nerve. There's no such thing as a central nervous system that's a nerve or whatever. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they're all named. But the names are pretty easy, and particularly if you know the vertebrae, they're basically named after the corresponding vertebrae. But remember, you had 7 cervical vertebrae. Remember that C1, C2, C1 was the atlas, C2 is the axis. But look at this, you have 8 cervical pairs of cervical vertebrae, or cervical spinal nerves. 8 pairs, and they're named the same with C1 through C8. So why is this? Well, C1 emerges between the skull and the atlas. And so you got your skull, then your atlas, and then between the two, that's where C1, the nerve, emerges. Underneath C1, the vertebra, underneath the atlas, that's where C2 emerges. And so C2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 emerges between C7 and T1, okay? And this is only the first 8 spinal nerves are kind of offset like this. All the other spinal nerves correspond number for number with the vertebrae. Because remember, you had 12 thoracic vertebrae, and here you have 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. And they're all named T1 through T12. And again, from this point on, T1, the vertebra, underneath it would be T1, the nerve. And then T2, the vertebra, underneath it would be T2, the nerve. And it's like that the entire length of the spinal cord, okay? So, and if you look carefully, you can kind of see all that in there. You'd have to zoom in on it quite a bit. Of course, after your thoracic vertebrae, you have lumbar vertebrae, and of course you have lumbar spinal nerves, and they're named L1 through L5, all right? They contribute to the lumbar vertebrae, the lumbar spinal nerves, I should say, the lumbar spinal nerves, contribute to the cauda equina in part. Remember the horse's tail? So what all makes up the horse's tail? Well, spinal nerves, maybe L2, maybe L3, and then everything after that pretty much. Remember, you had 5 sacral vertebrae, but they fused together to form the sacrum, okay? But your spinal nerves don't do anything like that. They're still separate. So you actually have 5 separate sacral pairs of spinal nerves, and they're named S1 through S5. And they all contribute to the cauda equina in part. The first 4, S1 through S4, exit via sacral foramina. Remember those 4 pairs of holes that are in the sacrum? And then there was the sacral hiatus. That's where S5 comes out. The S5 exits the sacral hiatus, all right? And then that's 30. If you add all that up, that's 30, right? And then you have 31 pairs. And the 31st pair of spinal nerves are known as the coccygeal pair, okay? And the abbreviation, look at the abbreviation, it's C sub 0 to distinguish it from these guys up here, C1 through C8. So C sub 0, that's the last pair, the coccygeal pair. Again, it's part of the cauda equina, and it exits via the sacral hiatus along with S5. See that? Remember these last 2. So there you go. Those are all your spinal nerves and what they do. Now, let's look at them. So spinal nerves and their branches. Looking at how they're built, basically. If you look at them, spinal nerves have 2 separate attachment points, and you kind of saw that already when you were looking at the spinal cord. So here's a vertebra right here. This would be this level right here, what we're looking at. Well, do we know? This could be just about anywhere. Anyway, they all the spinal nerves start out like this, basically. Remember, you got your spinal cord with its dorsal horns and ventral horns, and you look at the attachment points right there, and then they come out and then they start splitting. Okay, so we're talking about the branches. So 2 separate attachment points, a ventral root. Here's the ventral horn. You can see the ventral roots attaching right there. Of course, those contain just pure motor fibers. Remember, the ventral horns were just pure motor, and the dorsal horns were pure sensory. So you can guess what the dorsal roots are going to have. The dorsal roots, the ones in the back, here and here, contain just pure sensory fibers. Also associated with the dorsal roots, or this swelling right here, which is called a dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is, you have 2 things in the nervous system. You have nuclei and ganglia. And what they are, they're basically the same thing. When you have neurons, a collection of neurons, maybe you have axons and dendrites in the cell body, and the cell body's bigger, right? It's fat. Well, when you have a collection of them together, all grouped together, it forms a swelling. And if that occurs in the central nervous system, like in the brain and spinal cord, it's called a nucleus. But outside of that, in the peripheral nervous system, like right here, it's just a collection of cell bodies of neurons, and it forms this swelling. And so we call it a ganglion. So anytime you hear ganglia, or it's plural for ganglion, anytime you hear ganglia, it's just cell bodies of neurons. And so you see that right here. That's only in the dorsal root, and that's that pure sensory part. Okay, so that's an anatomical association right there. Now, if you follow the roots out, you just follow them, and then right here on this side, everything's covered up. On this side, it's cut away, so you can see what's going on with the roots. They travel for a short way, and then right about here, they're in the intervertebral foramen. Right about the level of the intervertebral foramen, they merge to form a common structure. And so that technically, once the roots unite, forms the nerve. And since the nerve, the spinal nerve in this case, is formed from the union of a sensory root and a motor root, it is a mixed nerve. And all spinal nerves form like this. And so all 31 pairs of spinal nerves are mixed nerves because it contains both sensory and motor fibers. Get it? Now, when we look at cranial nerves, they're not formed like this. And so some cranial nerves will be mixed, some of them will be pure sensory, some of them will be pure motor, but all spinal nerves are mixed. All right, so there you go. Now, from the spinal nerve, which is if you think about technically the spinal nerve, what you define as a spinal nerve, just the union of those roots, it's very small. It's only about this long before it starts splitting up. And so everything beyond the intervertebral foramen is a branch of the spinal nerve, okay? And so we talk about the branches. And so from the spinal nerve, there's primary branches that develop, which are called rami. The word, probably mentioned this at some point in the past, a rami is plural. It means branches. And so singular would be a ramus, which means branch, ramus, same thing. So you have different branches or different rami of the spinal nerve, okay? Look closely from that intervertebral foramen where you got the spinal nerve, and then you got a branch that comes back. That's the dorsal ramus. The dorsal ramus, if you follow it back dorsally, it innervates the skin and the muscles on your back dorsally. So this is some muscle here, it goes out to the skin. So everything you feel on your back, your torso, that's associated with the dorsal ramus. Okay, now look at this. The biggest part of the spinal nerve is the ventral ramus. You look, it's thick, heavy duty right here, but they chopped it off. Because it's going to go way out here, way out here. But they do different things. It depends on what level on the vertebral column you are, all right? So I tell you, the ventral rami of T1 through T12, that's the second thoracic pair all the way down to the 12th thoracic pair of spinal nerves. All of those, basically in your torso, okay, all those rami come out and form the intercostal nerves. Intercostal means between the ribs. So they basically are following your ribs. That makes sense, because your ribs are kind of coming around and you got nerves that are following those. All those nerves are branches of the spinal nerve. Technically, they're the ventral rami, okay? And they come out and they basically do the same thing, but in the front. They innervate the skin and the muscles laterally and ventrally. So you feel on your chest and your side, that's all a ventral ramus. Now, what do all the other ventral rami do? All the other ventral rami besides T2 through T12. Well, that's C1 through T1, and then L1 all the way through C sub 0. Remember all these? Those ventral rami come out and form a nervous plexus or plexuses. You have 4 nervous plexuses which serve the appendages. So the ventral rami come out and form a network of intercommunicating and kind of mixing branches that form nerves for your appendages. Okay, so you don't have a bunch of little separate little rami going out to your arms and legs. They all kind of merge together. And so you have brachial plexuses and femoral plexuses, for your legs and arms. And of course, then from there, you have other nerves that branch out, and the branches have branches, and branches have branches, and so forth. But I'm going to spare you all that. So let's go back to the branches of the spinal nerve. So dorsal rami, ventral rami, and then the rami communicantes, or the communicating branches. These serve the autonomic nervous system by forming the sympathetic chain ganglia, or also known as the paravertebral ganglia. Remember we talked about that when we talked about the fight or flight division of the autonomic nervous system. Look carefully right here. You can see a little bitty swollen thing right there. Remember a ganglion? Well, they got these little branches coming off right here and here. Those are innervating and connecting to these ganglia. Remember, you have short preganglionic axons and then postganglionic axons. Remember all that? Well, these are the short preganglionic, which are associated with the sympathetic nervous system. And remember, you had long postganglionic fibers that are heading out to your effectors that release acetylcholine, et cetera, et cetera. Remember all that? Well, here they are. This is what it looks like. And this is what they do. And so the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't do this. You only see this in the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so there you go. There's that. Now, those are all your spinal nerves. Now for the cranial nerves, these are the fun ones. And maybe that's why I saved these for last. Because they're associated with the skull, and I think the skull is cool. Maybe that's why I did it. I don't know. Cranium, skull, get it? Where your brain is located. There's these are, of course, associated with the brain. The 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They all exit the cranial cavity via various foramina. So there's holes. Some of them are specifically for the spinal or for the cranial nerves, and some cranial nerves exit other openings as well. They come out of the brain, specifically the brain stem for the most part, except the olfactory nerves, which attach to the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. And that makes sense too, because remember we were talking about the diencephalon and talking about the thalamus. I said all sensory information synapse there before going to various areas of the cortex, except olfactory, the sense of smell. That doesn't go to the thymus. It goes directly to the temporal lobe, and it has tracks. We'll see that go bypasses the thymus. Anyway, the cranial nerves, they all innervate the head and neck. That makes sense because up there, just right around this area where you got stuff going on, you need that kind of innervation. Except the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the only one that actually descends down and leaves the head and neck and actually enters the ventral body cavity. And yeah, that's what they call the vagus nerve. The word vagus, not Vegas like Las Vegas, it's spelled different, right? This is V-A-G-U-S, and Las Vegas is V-E-G-A-S, isn't it? Yeah, so a little bit different. I'm not sure what V-E-G-A-S means. Maybe it means the same thing, just a different spelling. But V-A-G-U-S means the wanderer. It wanders, something that wanders. And so this is the wanderer because it wanders out of the head and neck, goes down into the ventral body cavity. And we will see that it is, part of that cranial sacral division of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so, it's one of those cranial nerves that's associated with that. Anyway, so here's what I did for the cranial nerves. Oh no, one of Mr. Williams' infamous tables we got to memorize. That's right. I built this table, and there are 12 cranial nerves, and they're all named. And there's two different ways we name them. We name them by Roman numerals. Like the first one is Roman numeral 1 or a capital I, right? The second one is II, or, like this. And the third one is III. You know your Roman numerals? All right, there you go. They're all numbered. And the way they are numbered, let me back up here for a second. If you look at this, because this is inferior view kind of looking up, of course, your spinal cord is kind of, it's kind of coming at you. They're numbered in the order in which they emerge from the brainstem. So from cranial to caudal. So from here all the way down towards the spinal cord until you're almost out of it's coming at you. So this is like the spinal cord down here. You're going up away from the spinal cord, up more superficially. See what I'm saying? And so that's 1 through 12. And of course, 1 through 12, they also have names. And a lot of times the name of that nerve is associated with its function, okay? And so what I did with my table here, I listed them in order, 1 through 12, and I give it its name. That's what's going on in the first column. In the second column here, I tell you about its fibers. Remember I said all spinal nerves are mixed, but that's not true for cranial nerves. Sometimes cranial nerves are mixed, but sometimes they're sensory, sometimes they're motor. And so I list here, what type of fibers the cranial nerve contains. And this third column, I give you its function, basically what it does. Some of them have special functions, some of them not so much. And then the last column, I list its passage. The passage is how it exits the skull, okay? And it's usually some kind of opening or a foramen or something, all right? So let's talk about this. The cranial nerve, number one, the olfactory nerve. Anytime you hear olfactory, think smell, sense of smell. So it's a pure sensory nerve because that's just for your special sense of smell, or olfaction, as we also call it. And this exits the cranial cavity by way of the cribriform foramina, or sometimes they're called olfactory foramina. Remember it's for the olfactory nerve, right? Olfactory foramina. The cribriform foramina or the olfactory foramina are in the cribriform plate. Remember where the cribriform plate was located? That's that top plate of the ethmoid bone that's visible in the anterior cranial floor, where you had the notch that's cut out in the frontal bone. Remember the ethmoid notch? Well, the ethmoid notch is to accommodate the ethmoid bone, and that portion is where you have the olfactory foramina descending down from the cranial cavity through this bunch of little holes. Foramina means holes. There's a bunch of them in the ethmoid bone. So anyway, that's where it's located. Second cranial nerve, the optic nerve. That's pretty easy. When you think optic, you think eyes, right? Again, that's a pure sensory nerve for vision or for sight. That's its function. Of course, it's connected to the eyeball, the back of the eyeball. When we study the special senses, we'll look at all of this. And its passage is the optic foramen. It's a special hole in the back of the eye socket in the sphenoid bone. Remember the sphenoid bone, the greater wings, lesser wings, at the base of the lesser wings. There's a perfect, nice, pretty little round hole. Or if you look at an articulated skull, you look at the back of the eye sockets, and you'll see some fissures, and the base of the superior orbital fissures, a nice, pretty, round, perfect hole, and that's for the optic foramen. And all mammals are just like that, and most vertebrates too. Okay. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. You look at the word oculomotor. What does that tell you? Oculomotor. What does it sound like? Ocular means eye. Motor means to move. And so, hey, an eye movement nerve. That makes sense, right? So it's a motor nerve associated with eye movement, all right? And when we study the eyeball, we're going to study the eyeball and accessory structures of the eye, et cetera, all kinds of cool stuff about the eye. Well, you'll see that there are 6 extrinsic eye muscles that move the eyeball, 4 of those 6 are innervated by this cranial nerve, all right? And the others are innervated by other cranial nerves, and I'll share that with you. But anyway, the oculomotor nerve, or cranial nerve number 3, exits the skull by way of the superior orbital fissure. Remember, the superior orbital fissure is that space that occurs between the lesser and greater wings of the sphenoid. Remember the sphenoid looks like a bat? Okay, superior orbital fissure. A lot of things, you'll see, a lot of things come out of the superior orbital fissure. That's the back of the eye socket. Cranial nerve number 4, that's the trochlear nerve. Remember we had that word trochlea. Trochlea is like a spool thing that's in your humerus. We have a trochlea in your eye socket too. And the trochlea in your eye socket is a ligament that helps guide one of the extrinsic eye muscles to the top of your eyeball. And it's one muscle. I don't know why. You would think that, you know, you have cranial nerves. They do a bunch of things, you know, like cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, it innervates 4 extrinsic eye muscles. So it does a lot. But this one, this cranial nerve, it innervates just one extrinsic eye muscle. There's the extrinsic eye muscle called the superior oblique. That's one of the extrinsic eye muscles. And it has its very own cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve, or cranial nerve number 4. That's the only thing that cranial nerve does. That muscle is the only thing that's being innervated by, okay? Small, it's probably one of the smallest cranial nerves. It just barely comes out, innervates this muscle. It follows the oculomotor nerve coming out. I don't know why they're not together, but it's like this in all vertebrates. All your mammals, all the way down through fish. If you look at fish, the exact same. Anything that has eyeballs, like sharks have eyes, just like you have eyes. They have 6 extrinsic eye muscles, and they're innervated by the exact same cranial nerves. Anyway, there's number 4. Now look at number 5. 5, that's V. See, 5 for V, or V for 5. Then I have V sub 1, V sub 2, V sub 3. Oh no, he's adding stuff. Yeah, that's right. Trigeminal. What's trigeminal mean? Remember quadrigemina? What did quadrigemina mean? Remember when we talked about the mesencephalon, and then you had cerebral peduncles in the front and the corpora quadrigemina in the back. You forgot that already? Y'all haven't been keeping up. Before you know it, you're going to be overwhelmed by all this stuff. This third exam is going to be I don't want to get in trouble. But yeah, it's not going to be easy. Anyway, keep up. Trigeminal means triplets. Okay, and so cranial nerve number 5, this is the biggest one. It's huge. It's very, very thick, very large, like in the middle of the brain stem. Comes out, but it doesn't travel very far before it splits into 3. Okay, and the 3 branches of the trigeminal have names, and so I've listed the name: the first, second, third branch. The first branch is called the ophthalmic branch. The ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal. When you look at the word ophthalmic, what do you think about? You ever heard that word before? Ophthalmic? Or what's an ophthalmoscope? Ophthalmoscope? Ophthalmoscope. I think I'm saying that right. Ophthalmoscope. Where do you look at with an ophthalmoscope? You ever seen one of those special lights that a physician looks into your eye with? It's like a flashlight, but has a special dials on it, and he looks into your eye, or she looks in your. It's called an ophthalmoscope. Ophthalmoscope is to look in the eye. So something that is ophthalmic is associated with the eye. Okay, so there's more eye stuff. You know, you look at all these cranial nerves. You know, you think, cranial nerves. You know, what's going on with the head? You know, you get stuff. There's a lot of attention that goes to the eyeballs. The eyeballs are very nerve hungry. So the ophthalmoscope, the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve is associated with the eye. It comes out and runs through the top of the eye socket. Here, I tell you, it's a sensory nerve, not for special sense, but general sensory. General sensory is like touch, pain, that kind of thing. This innervates the upper third of your face. And so if you break your face into thirds, you know, top third, middle third, bottom third, top third, right up here, that's up the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal nerve. This branch exits by way of the superior orbital fissure and the superior orbital foramen. Okay, so it comes out of the back of the eye socket, it travels along the top of your eye socket, and emerges right here. Remember the superior orbital fissures or the superior orbital notches? That's for the ophthalmic branch. There you go. Now you know why it's there. Okay. The second branch, you know, 1, 2, 3, that makes sense. The maxillary, because your upper jaw, basically your upper jaw, the maxillary branch. Maxillary branch is the branch of the trigeminal. Again, it's a sensory nerve, but general sensory, the middle third of your face. This too has two openings it passes through. Initially, it emerges the cranial cavity comes out an opening of the sphenoid bone. Remember the foramen rotundum, and then it enters the eye socket basically, and it travels at the bottom of the eye socket underneath your eyeball, and emerges underneath your eye socket by the infraorbital foramen. So the infraorbital foramen is for the maxillary branch. The supraorbital foramen is for the ophthalmic branch. That makes sense? Okay. Now finally, the mandibular. Think mandible, lower jaw, right? That's the third branch of the trigeminal. Now this is, of the three, it's the only one that's mixed. It has both sensory and motor fibers. The sensory is for the lower third of your face and your mouth floor. You ever had a shot in your jaw, like for Novocaine or dental work? This is what they're numbing the mandibular branch of the trigeminal. There you go. Its motor fibers innervate muscles of mastication. So your chewing muscles, that makes sense, right? It's going down here. So these muscles in your cheeks, innervated by the mandibular branch of the trigeminal. And then it exits. If you think about this branch, the mandibular branch, it's pretty busy. It's a pretty big nerve. It exits by way of the foramen ovale, which is a pretty decent sized hole in the sphenoid bone. Remember the oval hole, foramen? I don't know if you looked at that. Maybe you didn't look at that. But look at the, oh, you can see these. Did we study this one? Can't remember in my lab. I don't know. Some of you have a test today. Some of you have a test tomorrow. Have you had your lab? Are you in my lab? No. Are you in my lab? Oh, so she studied. No, it's not on there. I better not put it on there then, huh? Well, you can look at it. Anyway, that's the trigeminal. Number 5. Number 6. Abducens, more eye stuff. Look at the word abducens. Remember I told you about the word abduct? It means to move away or move away from midline or whatever. There's a cranial nerve called the abducens. So what are we moving away? Well, we're talking about abducting your eye. How do you abduct your eyes? Well, when you look to the side, this is my right eye. And if I abduct up my eye, I look sideways. Okay? If I abduct my left eye, I look that way. So there's one muscle that pulls on the side here or pulls on the side here. When it pulls on the outside muscles, they're called the lateral rectus muscles. When the lateral rectus contracts, it pulls the eyeball that way. This one contracts, pulls the eyeball that way. So that's abducting your eye. Just like the trochlear nerve. Remember the trochlear nerve, number 4? This one is the only cranial nerve. It only innervates one extrinsic eye muscle. So you have 3 cranial nerves innervating the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. 4 innervated by the oculomotor. 1 is innervated by the trochlear, and the others innervated by the abducens, and this specifically the lateral rectus. And when we study the eyeball and all those 6 of those muscles, we'll talk about which nerve plugs into which one. But anyway, for right now, the abducens, it's number 6. It's a motor nerve for eye movement, lateral rectus. And again, like most of the other things going to the eyeball or associated with the eye, it exits by way of the superior orbital fissure. Okay, now we're kind of starting to finally move away from the eye a little bit with the facial nerve. Number 7 is the facial nerve. It's a mixed nerve, so it has both motor and sensory portions. The motor portion has muscles of facial expression. Remember the risorius and all that kind of stuff? That's innervated by the facial nerve. That makes sense. It also innervates glands. That's maybe motor fibers going to glands, right? And so the glands, all the glands of the head except the parotid gland. The parotid gland is a large salivary gland near your ear, right here. So, except that one, okay? Now the sensory portion is all all your taste buds, the anterior 2/3 of your tongue. So most of your tongue, but in the front, okay? So the back third is going to be innervated by a different cranial nerve altogether. So anyway, the facial nerve, it's pretty busy. It does a lot of stuff. It's mixed, but ironically, it's very, very small. And the opening, and we know it's small because if you look at its passage, it exits the skull by way of the stylomastoid foramen. The stylomastoid foramen is a tiny little hole between the styloid process and the mastoid process in the temporal bone. And it's itty bitty. And it comes out and it innervates these muscles and glands, and that's it. Facial nerve. All right. You think it would, face, it would be much bigger. I don't know, I would think. Number 8. Number 8 is a kind of busy one. And it's known as the vestibulocochlear nerve. In older books, they might call it just the auditory nerve or the acoustic nerve. But the words auditory and acoustic are referring to just sound. And so sound, you think hearing, right? That's true. But the vestibulocochlear nerve is not just sound or hearing, it's hearing and equilibrium. And when we study the ear, you'll see what this word vestibulocochlear means and why we call it vestibulocochlear. But it is a pure sensory nerve. It's associated with the special senses of hearing and equilibrium. Remember, you have 5 special senses, and hearing and equilibrium are 2 of them, all right? And we'll talk about all the other senses. The vestibulocochlear nerve exits the cranial cavity by way of the internal auditory meatus. We have an external auditory meatus, your ear hole. Well, in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, there's another opening, a hole, a meatus, a passageway called the internal auditory meatus, and that's where cranial nerve number 8 travels. All right. Number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is the other cranial portion of the cranial sacral division of the autonomic nervous system. You have vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal. These are the 2. The glossopharyngeal. Look at the word glossopharyngeal. Gloss means tongue. Pharyngeal means throat. So tongue and throat. So we're getting like further down, right? It is a mixed nerve, and look at all the stuff it does. It's pretty busy. Mixed, so it has sensory and motor portions. Motor portions associated with muscles of swallowing, also salivary. Now this is, remember the facial nerve is all the salivary glands except the parotid. Well, this is the one that innervates the parotid gland, the large gland near your ear. The glossopharyngeal nerve is responsible for the gag reflex. You don't really have control over that. You're stimulating the glossopharyngeal nerve for that. And as far as autonomic nervous system, remember the parasympathetic nervous system or the cranial sacral division, well, it's associated with blood pressure and respiration regulation. That's the autonomic nervous system. Also, general sensory of the tongue, like you can feel tongue pain, that sort of thing. And also general sensory of the outer ear, near your parotid gland. And also taste. Remember the facial was anterior 2/3. Well, the posterior 1/3, that's the glossopharyngeal. Glosso for tongue, get it? Deep tongue, back of the throat. So the posterior 1/3. This cranial nerve that does all this stuff exits by way of the jugular foramen, or jugular, however you want to say it, which is a space that occurs between the petrous portion of the temporal bone and the occipital bone. It's opening in the skull. And then, of course, it's named after the vein that's draining the brain, the internal jugular vein. But there's other things that come out of the skull in the jugular foramen as well, including this cranial nerve and the next two cranial nerves as well. Cranial nerve 10, there's the vagus, the wanderer. Remember the wanderer? It's the only one that enters the ventral body cavity. It's just like the glossopharyngeal in the sense that it's mixed. Also innervating muscles associated with swallowing. Also taste. Special sense of taste. Move. There we go. Muscles of speech. Also pulmonary and cardiovascular and intestinal regulation. That's all autonomic nervous system stuff. And sensations of hunger, fullness, and intestinal discomfort. So if you have a tummy ache, blame the vagus nerve. You know, oh, my tummy hurts. You're stimulating your vagus nerve. It travels, it basically follows the internal jugular vein down and is neck and neck with the glossopharyngeal for a little while anyway, but it exits the jugular foramen. That's vagus nerve. Okay. These last two, 11 and 12, you only see in tetrapods. Fish and amphibians don't have they have these, but they're not in the skull. Once you get to birds and mammals, the skull is bigger and it actually encapsulates these two spinal nerves. And other, like amphibians and fish, these two nerves are actually spinal nerves. But anyway, number 11 is the accessory nerve, sometimes called the spinal accessory, because like I said, originally was a spinal nerve, but it's a motor nerve, has motor fibers associated with innervating muscles associated with swallowing, and also some back and neck muscles, the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoideus. Those are back and neck muscles. And it comes out of the skull by way of the jugular foramen. And then finally, the last one, number 12, is the hypoglossal nerve. Again, it's motor, and it innervates, we'll look at hypoglossal, which means like below the tongue. So deep tongue, very, very back of the tongue. It innervates the tongue, intrinsic and extrinsic tongue muscles, okay? What is intrinsic and extrinsic tongue muscles? Well, intrinsic means within, extrinsic means without or to the outside of. And so the intrinsic tongue muscles, those are the muscles that change the shape of the tongue. Can you roll your tongue? Can you see me doing that? Or change the shape of your tongue? Those are muscles. When we study the tongue and the digestive system, is that where we do it? Either digestive or special senses, one of the two. I can't remember. But we study the anatomy of the tongue. There's intrinsic tongue muscles, and that's what they do. They change the shape of the tongue. Extrinsic tongue muscles are actually attached to the outside of the tongue. Those are the ones that actually move the tongue. If you stick your tongue out or retract your tongue, pull it in, those are extrinsic muscles doing that. But it doesn't matter. Intrinsic, extrinsic, those muscles are all innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12, the very last one. And this one exits the skull by its very own opening called the hypoglossal canal, which is at the base of the, it's right there at the foramen magnum, right underneath the occipital condyles, two little holes. Well, there's a hole on the inside of the occipital condyle, on the outside of the occipital condyle. That's for the passage of this one. Of course, it's headed out on its way to the tongue to do all the fun tongue stuff. The end. We're done. That's the nervous system. And I'm not going to start anything new today. But what's today? Today's Thursday. Thank you. So next week, Tuesday, we'll start the special senses. That's fun. Well, I like the special senses because they're special, right? Okay, do you guys have any questions? Well, we've got 5 minutes to spare. Some of you are probably chomping at the bit, ready to go take your practical, huh? Okay, well, I'll let you go take your practical or go home and study this nervous system. And read up on your special senses. Doesn't hurt to study ahead of time a little bit. Okay, well, have a good weekend. I'll see you guys next week.